He didn't flinch when the gun fired. He didn't hesitate when the bullet sliced the air. He simply moved faster than thought, stronger than fear, shielding the man he loved with nothing but his own body. In that single heartbeat, everything they had hidden, everything they had survived, came crashing into the light. This is not just a story about survival. It's about a loyalty so fierce it could bring an empire of lies to its knees. If this story touches something deep inside you, I hope you'll like, subscribe, and stay with us. Tell me what part of this journey pulls at you the most, and where are you watching from? Your words matter here. The courthouse was drowning in that strange, syrupy stillness that follows a long battle when the verdict finally drops. All around the room, people exhaled the breath they had been holding, some in relief, others in barely hidden frustration. Overhead, the ceiling fans turned lazily, failing to move the heavy, humid air that clung to every surface. Judge Morales's gavel echoed once, twice, sealing the fate that everyone now had to live with. Case dismissed, charges dropped. "Mr. Carson, you're free to go," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of emotion, as if she too doubted what the court had decided but was shackled by the evidence, or rather, the lack thereof. Leon Carson, the biker at the center of it all, couldn't suppress the smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. His leather vest, adorned with patches that told stories no child should ever hear, strained against his chest as he rose head high, shoulders cocky. His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to question the outcome. He had won. Against all odds, against the stack of whispered rumors and half-baked accusations. He had walked free. Or so he thought. At the back of the courtroom, unnoticed by most, a man shifted in his seat. Elliot Brooks, his deep brown skin almost blending into the shadows, tightened his jaw, his fists curled on his knees. He knew better, knew the system, knew how truth could be bent, twisted, suffocated under the weight of privilege and manipulation. Elliot wasn't just any observer. He was a man who had once stood in that same defendant's chair, wrongfully convicted, his career, his life, shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. But today wasn't about him. It was about watching another lie be sanctified under oath. He might have kept silent, might have let it all slide into the darkness where old grievances went to die, if it hadn't been for Bruno. Bruno, the black and tan German shepherd sitting rigid at Elliot's side, barely moved throughout the proceedings. A mountain of muscle and discipline, Bruno had been trained to read the room better than most humans. And now, just as Leon Carson strutted toward the court exit, fishing casually in his pocket, whistling some tuneless song, Bruno's posture shifted. The fur along his massive shoulders stood on end. His ears pricked forward. A deep, bone-shaking growl rumbled from his chest, slicing through the courtroom's fragile peace like a scalpel. Heads turned. Eyes darted. Murmurs sprouted like weeds. Leon, oblivious at first, chuckled as he pulled his wallet free. The leather creaked between his fingers as he flipped it open, maybe to flash his ID one last time, a final act of mockery. But Bruno surged forward, dragging Elliot half out of his chair. The growl intensified, rising into a full-blown snarl that sent a visceral jolt through everyone present. The bailiff moved instinctively, a hand on his taser, unsure what the threat was but sensing the explosion building. "Bruno," Elliot hissed, gripping the leash tighter. Bruno didn't heal. His focus was absolute, laser-locked on Leon's wallet like it was a live grenade. Leon flinched, a crack appearing in his mask of arrogance. "The hell's wrong with your dog?" he barked, snapping the wallet shut and shoving it into his back pocket. Bruno lunged, not to attack but to reach the source, the very leather folds now bulging against Leon's jeans. The judge pounded her gavel again, calling for order, but the atmosphere had already mutated into something feral, volatile. Elliot's pulse hammered in his temples. His instincts, the ones that years of betrayal had honed razor sharp. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Bruno didn't react this way without reason. Not ever. "Step back, Mr. Carson," barked the bailiff, stepping between Leon and the snarling dog. Leon complied, but his hands shook ever so slightly, betraying the casual front he was desperate to maintain. Bruno growled low again, deep and guttural, vibrating through the floorboards. Elliot's gut twisted. He didn't know what was hidden in that wallet, but Bruno had sensed it. had declared it without words. There was rot hidden in plain sight. Leon's eyes flicked to the exits, calculating. The courtroom held its breath, teetering on the edge of chaos. Judge Morales, sensing the powder keg before her, leaned forward. "Mr. Carson," she said icily, "please return to the bench." Immediately, for the first time that morning, real sweat beaded on Leon's brow. He hesitated, and in that heartbeat the truth bared its teeth. Elliot stood, his voice cutting through the mutterings like a gunshot. "He's carrying something he shouldn't." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. The media smelled blood, a reversal so poetic it felt scripted. Leon blanched, his bravado crumbled. Bruno's growl never wavered, a living metronome of threat. Two deputies closed in from either side, moving in sync, hands poised near cuffs and batons. Leon backed up, his hands splaying outward, a silent plea or perhaps a stalling tactic. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, but the panic was raw now, stripping away the sweat. Elliot's stare pinned him to the spot. No need for words, no need for explanations. The dog had already delivered the verdict. In that slow, shattering instant, Elliot realized the trial wasn't over. It had barely begun. The air snapped tighter, crackling with invisible tension as Bruno, growling like a living storm, lunged forward again, his powerful jaws locking around the edge of Leon Carson's wallet with the brutal efficiency of years of canine training. The guttural snarl ripped through the room, and in one sudden, violent jerk, Bruno tore the wallet free from Leon's pocket, leather straining, stitching snapping under the force. Leon shouted in protest, staggering backward, hands reaching in, but it was too late. The contents of the wallet exploded into the air like shrapnel, cards and receipts fluttering like desperate birds trying to escape a predator. And amidst the chaos, one small laminated rectangle caught the courtroom's collective eye as it spun end over end through the heavy air and landed, face up, directly at Elliot Brooks's feet. Time seemed to fracture, everything moving in broken, syrupy frames as Elliot's gaze dropped to the ground, to the ID card resting there, an unfamiliar name printed boldly above a photograph that was unmistakably Leon Carson. The courtroom gasped in unison, a sound sharp and involuntary, the kind of sound made when a truth too ugly to ignore crashes through the walls of denial. Judge Morales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Mr. Carson, what is the meaning of this?" Her voice was steel, slicing clean through the mounting panic. Leon, pale now, opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Only the ragged heaving of a man who realized his flimsy house of lies was collapsing in real time. Bruno stood guard over the scattered contents like a sentinel, his body rigid, hackles raised, teeth bared in silent accusation. Elliot bent slowly, every movement deliberate, his fingers curling around the fraudulent idea. The courtroom's fluorescent lights reflected off the plastic surface, highlighting the inconsistencies, the faint watermark that didn't match official templates, the microprint errors only a trained eye would catch, the forgeries that screamed desperation to anyone who knew where to look. Elliot straightened, holding the ID aloft like a holy relic ripped from the jaws of the damned. His voice cut through the room, low but carrying the weight of 1,000 injustices. "This man," he said, "is not who he claims to be." A wave of murmurs surged forward, crashing against the cold walls of the courthouse. Reporters scrambled for cameras and notepads. Deputies shifted uneasily, waiting for orders that were slow to come. Leon took a half step back, his boots squeaking against the polished floor, and for a moment, it looked like he might bolt. Officers, Eunice and life, but Elliot, driven by something deeper than duty, by the raw, bleeding need for truth, took a step forward, ignoring the stunned looks, ignoring the bailiff's outstretched hand, ignoring the chorus of outrage rising behind him. "This isn't the first time," Elliot said, and though his words were calm, they struck the room like hammer blows. "5 years ago I stood right there," he pointed at the defendant's chair, his hands steady, "and I was convicted based on false testimony, on planted evidence, on lies just like this." Every syllable peeled back a layer of polite civility, exposing the festering wound underneath. "I lost everything," Elliot continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Your badge, my freedom, my life." A ripple of unease spread through the spectators. whispers darting like shadows. And you? Elliot locked eyes with Leon, whose bravado was crumbling visibly. You were part of it. The room tilted, as if the gravity itself shifted. Bruno stood beside Elliot, the two of them framed together in a tableau of righteous fury. A man and his dog, battered by a system that had tried to break them but failed. Judge Morales banged her gavel once, hard enough to leave a dent in the wood. Order! Order in this court, she demanded, but order had already fled, replaced by something wilder, something more primal, truth clawing its way into the open after years buried alive. The two deputies finally closed in on Leon, cuffing him with mechanical efficiency, but their hands trembled, the weight of the moment settling heavily onto their shoulders. Your Honor, one of them said, what's under the wallet contents? The false ID now seared into everyone's memory. Judge Morales pressed her fingers to her temples, breathing deeply before responding. Secure all evidence, she ordered, and place Mr. Carson in holding pending further investigation. As they dragged Leon away, his protests grew weaker, swallowed by the murmuring tide of spectators whose faith in the system flickered uncertainly. Elliot remained standing, his heart hammering against his ribs. She said, I don't know what you're doing here today, but I suggest you stay available for questioning. Elliot inclined his head, the ghost of a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Wasn't planning on going anywhere, Your Honor. His voice was gravel and thunder, heavy with unspoken promises. The courtroom buzzed with a volatile energy, the tectonic plates of power and deceit shifting dangerously beneath their feet. The media cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression, every bead of sweat, every tremor of a system about to crack wide open. And in that suspended breath before chaos reigned, Elliot lowered his gaze to Bruno, scratching behind the dog's ear in silent thanks. Bruno's tail thumped once, a low, steady beat against the cracked linoleum. Somewhere deep inside Elliot's chest, hope stirred for the first time in years, fragile but undeniable. But hope was dangerous in a world built on lies, and as the deputies hurriedly collected evidence and escorted the biker out through a side door, none of them noticed the slight figure slipping quietly from the farthest row of benches. None of them noticed the glint of a badge that should have been buried long ago catching the overhead lights for a brief, damning second. None of them noticed that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hum of voices buzzed against the cracked plaster of the courtroom walls, thick and frantic, as deputies forced Leon Carson toward the side exit. His body twisted in frantic resistance, his mouth spilling a stream of denials and threats and half-formed excuses that no one truly heard, because their attention had already shifted, locked onto something bigger, something older, something rotting beneath the surface, for far longer than this morning's spectacle. Elliot Brooks stood unmoving, his hand resting lightly on Bruno's strong shoulders, his eyes drilling into the chaos with a grim, terrible clarity, because he recognized the stink of fear that clung to Carson like a second skin. And it wasn't just fear of getting caught lying today. It was deeper, older, and far more damning, the way a man smells when the skeletons he's buried start clawing their way out of shallow graves. The pieces clicked together in Elliot's mind, not as a revelation but as a confirmation of what he had suspected all along. 5 years ago, when he had been dragged through a trial that stank of manufactured evidence and rehearsed testimonies, there had been a key witness, a reluctant nobody who had seen Elliot at the scene of a crime he hadn't committed, a man whose vague answers and shifting details had nonetheless carried enough poisoned weight to tip the scales of justice. That man had gone by another name back then, but Elliot had never forgotten his face, and now here he was, pretending to be Leon Carson, and for the first time in years Elliot felt the old rage simmering back to the surface, thick and alive, not the cold anger of disappointment, but the white-hot fury of betrayal. Bruno growled low in his throat, sensing the shift in his master's body, the subtle tightening of muscles that spoke of coming violence. Judge Morales was shouting for order again, her gavel hammering uselessly against a system already hemorrhaging authority. But Elliot didn't hear her, didn't hear the rising clamor, because his eyes had caught another movement at the far side of the room. A tall figure in a dark, impeccably tailored suit slipping through the panicked crowd with the unnatural ease of a predator retreating into the jungle. It was a man Elliot knew well, though it had been years since he'd seen him in person. Interim Police Chief Raymond Vance. The man who had stepped in as the department's savior when scandal had gutted the leadership. The man who had smiled too easily, promised reform too eagerly, and who, Elliot had long suspected, had more blood on his hands than half the criminals he claimed to fight. Vance moved with calculated purpose. A shark slicing through schools of smaller fish. His head bowed just enough to avoid notice, but not so much as to appear suspicious. His right hand brushing occasionally against the hidden bulge under his jacket where a weapon or a burner phone likely waited. Elliot's gut twisted. Bruno gave a soft huff, muscles tensing under Elliot's hand. Without conscious thought, Elliot began moving, slipping sideways through the press of bodies. His movements fluid, predatory, silent, every nerve ending burning with the certainty that if Vance walked out of the doors loomed ahead, heavy oak stained dark with a century of sweat and despair, and beyond them, the parking lot stretched under the merciless noon sun. The world outside, too bright, too oblivious. Elliot surged forward, but a shoulder bumped him sideways. A hand grabbed his arm. A deputy's barked warning about staying put, but Bruno snapped his teeth an inch from the man's thigh, and instinctively the deputy recoiled, giving Elliot the opening he needed. He slipped into the river of bodies flowing for the exits, searching for the shark among minnows, and there he was, Vance, almost free, almost safe, almost gone. Elliot's heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum, each beat screaming, "Move, move!" But before he could call out, before he could force the crowd, a flash of movement caught the edge of his vision. A woman in a blue suit, her face twisted with fear, stepping directly into Vance's path. There was a brief struggle, a sharp, wordless exchange, something small and metallic changing hands between them. In a move so fast most eyes missed it, but not Elliot's. His training, his survival instincts honed to a razor's edge, catalogued every detail, the slight tremor in the woman's hand, the way Vance pocketed it without breaking stride. And Elliot knew whatever that device was, it was the keystone to the entire rotten structure teetering above them. The woman disappeared into the mass of bodies, and Vance pushed through the doors, blinking into the sunlight like a demon banished from its cave. Elliot followed, Bruno tight against his leg, the leash taut as a bowstring. The heat hit them like a wave, bouncing off the cracked asphalt, distorting the edges of the world into a shimmering nightmare. Vance was 20 feet ahead, moving briskly but not running. Not yet. Confident in the chaos behind him, confident that no one would dare follow. Elliot gritted his teeth, ignoring the sweat trickling down his spine, the ache in his injured knee, the old ghosts whispering doubts in his ear. The sun caught the badge clipped to Vance's belt, a gleaming reminder of the authority he still wielded, the lies he still wore like, and for one insane moment, Elliot imagined ripping it from his body, hurling it into the dust, stripping away the mask for all to see. The courthouse doors banged open behind him, and Elliot heard shouting, more deputies pouring out, confused, angry, overwhelmed, looking for someone to blame, looking for someone to stop. Bruno pulled forward, almost dragging Elliot, nose low, body quivering with purpose, and that was when Vance finally glanced back over his shoulder. Just a flicker of movement behind predator and prey, past and present colliding in a single, silent explosion. And for the first time since the trial began, Elliot saw it. The fear, the recognition, the knowledge that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Vance broke into a run. The heat shimmered off the blacktop like waves of invisible fire as Vance sprinted across the courthouse parking lot, weaving between rows of sun-scorched vehicles, his expensive shoes slipping on the melting tar, his breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Elliot surged after him, every muscle screaming in protest. But it wasn't just the chase that fed his fury. It was the years, the lost time, the smirking lies of men like Vance who believed they could bury truth under badges and paperwork. And Bruno, the black and tan shadow at Elliot's side, strained against the leash, every fiber of his being humming with predatory intent. They were closing the distance, narrowing the gap second by second. Vance glanced back again, panic etched across his slick face. He veered hard to the left, cutting between two SUVs, his hand fumbling inside his jacket. For a moment Elliot thought he was going for a weapon, and his fingers twitched toward his own side instinctively. But instead, something small and black tumbled from Vance's pocket, hitting the ground with a muted clatter that was lost beneath the roar of the street. Bruno's head snapped toward the noise instantly, his entire body pivoting in mid-stride. Elliot almost stumbled as the dog yanked him sideways, pulling not toward Vance but toward the object lying abandoned between the oil-stained tires. Instinct screamed to stay on Vance, to not let him slip away, but years of trusting Bruno over his own judgment rooted Elliot's feet to the ground. He followed the dog, heart hammering a furious rhythm against his ribs. Bruno reached the device first, his nose darting down, sniffing furiously. Elliot dropped to one knee beside him, squinting against the sun's brutal glare. It was a two-ways radio, sleek, black government issue, not the kind civilians carry, not something a man like Vance should have on him. Unless he was coordinating something much bigger than a desperate escape. Elliot scooped it up, the plastic warm from the midday heat, static crackling faintly from the tiny speaker. And then a voice broke through, harsh, mechanical low. Target moving west, confirm visual, eliminate if clean shot available. Elliot froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice wasn't Vance's, it was someone else. Someone still active, someone hunting. Bruno growled, his teeth flashing in the brutal sunlight. Elliot lifted his eyes in time to see Vance disappearing around the far corner of the courthouse, moving not randomly but with purpose, with intent, like a man running to a second rendezvous, not away from danger but toward reinforcements, fitting the pieces together faster than his breath could catch. Vance hadn't panicked when the ID fell. He hadn't lost control when the courtroom erupted. He had expected it, or at least planned for the possibility, which meant backup, which meant a cleanup crew ready to erase loose ends, and Elliot, now holding a live radio, was the loosest end of them all. Bruno, Elliot barked, snapping the leash short, and together they pivoted, running low and fast across the parking lot, cutting diagonally to intercept. The radio squawked again, another voice, tense, clipped. Visual acquired, proceed with caution, primary asset still unsecured. The words chilled Elliot deeper than the sweat rolling down his spine. Primary asset, not Leon Carson, not the trial, but something or someone else, and he knew with a gut-deep certainty that it was about the woman in the blue suit, the one who had slipped the device to Vance moments before he bolted. Whatever she had given him wasn't just insurance, it was the key, the evidence, the leverage necessary to blow this conspiracy wide open. But it also meant she was now a target. Elliot and Bruno barreled through the narrow alley behind the courthouse, feet pounding against broken concrete, heartbeats sinking to the primal urgency of the hunt. Ahead, Vance's figure flickered through patches of shadow, weaving, desperate but not without purpose. He was guiding someone, signaling unseen hunters with every panicked glance. And the trap was closing in. Bruno barked once, sharp and urgent, his nose cutting through the tangled scents of gasoline and asphalt to lock onto the invisible thread that bound predator to prey. Elliot tightened his grip on the leash, feeling the raw power coiling in Bruno's muscles. Trusting it, surrendering to it. Vance disappeared behind a rusted service door, slamming it behind him, and for half a heartbeat Elliot hesitated, scanning the rooftops, the windows, and the lurking shadows where a sniper's scope might already be trained on him. The radio crackled again, a whisper barely audible through the static. Stand by, target approaching kill zone. Kill zone. The words sliced deeper than bullets. Elliot's hands clenched reflexively, rage igniting his nerves into action. He shoved the door open, Bruno lunging ahead into the gloom. They found themselves in a maintenance corridor, dimly lit and stinking of mildew and oil, echoes bouncing disorientingly off the stained concrete walls. At the far end, a silhouette moved. Vance, his posture no longer frantic but calculated. A man stepping into his role with cold precision. Elliot advanced slowly, cautiously. Bruno pressed against his leg, the radio tight in his hand, every instinct screaming that they were walking into something carefully laid, deliberately cruel. And then another figure stepped out of the darkness behind Vance. Tall, broad, wearing tactical gear that screamed unofficial, and in his hands gleamed a silencer-tipped weapon. Bruno snarled, his hackles lifting in a wave of instinctive fury. Elliot's heart jackhammered against his ribs, his mouth dry as sand. The man didn't speak, didn't threaten, just raised the weapon with mechanical efficiency, ready to erase the last obstacle between them and their buried truths. Bruno's body tensed, ready to spring Elliot's perfectly spotted options. None of them good, none of them guaranteed. The barrel of the silenced weapon leveled at Elliot's chest, the dim maintenance corridor trapping them like prey in a kill box designed with surgical cruelty. Every nerve in Elliot's body screamed for action. But the distance was wrong, the angles all wrong, and he knew without doubt that even if he dove, just another forgotten casualty in a war no one would admit existed. Elliot's fingers tightened on the leash, feeling Bruno's quivering readiness, the coiled fury that begged for release. But even Bruno, fast as he was, couldn't outrun a bullet at this range. Vance's voice slithered through the gloom, smug and low. "Should have stayed buried, Brooks," he said, and the killer shifted his stance almost lazily, lining up the shot with the finality of a man punching a time card. And that was when Elliot did the only thing left, something no logic could explain but instinct demanded. He whistled, not just any whistle, but 3 sharp rising notes, a code burned into the marrow of an old life, a code almost forgotten except by those who had lived and bled under it. For a split second, nothing happened. The world teetered on the knife edge of annihilation, and then Bruno exploded into motion. Not at random, not wild, but with chilling precision. A blur of muscle and fury trained to react to that exact signal. The killer squeezed the trigger, but Bruno wasn't. The bullet hissed harmlessly into the concrete wall. Bruno slammed into the man's knees with bone force. Snarling, jaws flashing, the gun clattered to the floor, skittering out of reach. Vance cursed and stumbled back, reaching under his jacket for another weapon. But Elliot was already moving, propelled by something deeper than adrenaline, deeper than rage. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and drove his shoulder into Vance, sending them both crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Vance grunted, elbowing viciously, but Elliot twisted, using the momentum to slam him down hard onto the floor. The radio in Elliot's pocket crackled again, panicked voices shouting over each other, too late to help, too far to stop what was already unraveling. Bruno stood over the disarmed killer, teeth bared, growling low, his chest heaving. Elliot pinned Vance's arm behind his back, pressing down with his knee, years of training reawakening with brutal clarity. And for a moment, there was only the rasp of breathing, the scrape of boots against filthy concrete, the undeniable knowledge that something irreversible had just shifted. Vance twisted his head enough to glare up at Elliot, blood seeping from a split lip. "You don't know what you're messing with," he spat, his voice venomous. "You think this ends with me?" Elliot leaned closer, his voice a rasp against Vance's ear. "It ends when the truth drowns you," he growled. Bruno whined softly, an urgent, restless sound, and Elliot knew they couldn't linger, not here, not with backup closing in. He yanked Vance upright, shoving him ahead down the corridor. The gunman's weapon kicked into a corner where no one could reach it without a firefight. They moved quickly, Elliot's hand fisted in the back of Vance's jacket, Bruno circling like a living shield. The faintest echo of footsteps filtered from the far end of the hall. Purposeful. A second team moving to intercept. Elliot's mind raced, calculating the twists and turns of the maintenance tunnels. But time was a knife pressed against their throats now. They burst through a side door into a narrow alley reeking of hot trash and gasoline, the sun slamming into their eyes like a physical blow. Elliot staggered but kept moving, dragging Vance with brutal efficiency. Bruno pivoted into a defensive arc, scanning the rooftops and windows, always searching, always guarding. They needed cover, distance, something, anything. And then, through the maelstrom of adrenaline and sweat and fury, a memory surfaced, raw and bright. Bruno sitting rigid at Elliot's side years ago. A green recruit with ears too big for his head, struggling to learn commands Elliot had drilled into him day after day under the pitiless desert sun. The memory hit so hard Elliot almost stumbled because Bruno hadn't just been any canine unit assigned to him. Bruno had been his first, his only, trained by Elliot himself when the army still called him Sergeant Brooks, when loyalty was a bond measured in blood and bone and survival, not paperwork and lies and survival. Through the bureaucratic betrayal that had ripped Elliot's world apart, through the years they had been separated, Bruno had found his way back, the universe folding in on itself to give them this impossible second chance. And now, in this alley choked with garbage and danger, that bond flared back to life, molten and unbreakable. Bruno, Elliot rasped, and the dog's ears pricked, his gaze snapping to Elliot's face. A silent communication passing between them. Elliot tightened his grip on Vance, his other hand fumbling in his pocket for the spare zip ties he always carried out of habit more than hope. But even as he worked, the radio squawked again, clearer now, a woman's voice cold and certain. Package compromised. Authorization to terminate all witnesses. Bruno growled low, vibrating against Elliot's leg. Sensing the tightening noose, Vance twisted again, trying to break free. But Bruno lunged, a sharp bark freezing Vance in place. The man flinching back from the dog's snapping teeth. Elliot finished securing Vance's wrists. The plastic biting deep into sweaty flesh, he dragged the man backward, retreating into the mouth of another alley, Bruno shielding them with his body. Elliot whistled again. 3 short, sharp, and Bruno responded instantly, pivoting into a guard stance, ears pinned, muscles bunched for action. It wasn't just training anymore. It was memory, trust reforged in the fires of betrayal and survival. And Elliot knew as surely as he knew his own name that whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The roar of engines filled the alley, motorcycles and SUVs closing in from both ends, shadows looming long and predatory across the cracked pavement. The trap was springing shut, the lasso tightening around their throats, and still Elliot didn't waver. Different battlefields, same war, and this time they would not be the ones left bleeding in the dust. The engines roared louder, swallowing the narrow alleys in their mechanical growl, a sound not of arrival but of encirclement. Elliot crouched low behind a battered dumpster, his hand fisted tight in Vance's jacket. Bruno pressed against his side like a living shield, the heat off the asphalt rising in shimmering waves that distorted the oncoming threat into monstrous silhouettes. Elliot's mind spun, calculating, recalculating, rejecting the notion of coincidence. Vance hadn't run blindly, hadn't dropped that radio by accident. Every move from the moment the trial started had been a carefully placed domino in a chain reaction designed to bury Elliot again. Not in a courtroom but 6 feet under. Leon Carson, the biker, had just been a decoy, a sacrificial pawn whose purpose was to draw Elliot out into the open, to make him visible, vulnerable, and now the real players, the ones who didn't trust the legal system's slow strangulation, had sent a kill team to finish what injustice had started years ago. Elliot gritted his teeth, feeling the betrayal like acid in his veins. They had used Carson's trial as bait, staged the fake ID drop, orchestrated the escape, all to flush Elliot into making a move, and he had walked right into it. Dragged by anger and old wounds, and the blind need for closure, Bruno gave a low rumble, his hackles bristling, signaling that the encirclement was nearly complete. Elliot tightened his grip on the radio, static hissing like snakes between broken commands. Fragments of orders bleeding through, Thatch's. The words made no sense until they slammed into place. An electric jolt of realization that almost made Elliot stagger. The courthouse, not the alley, not the parking lot, but the very heart of the trial. The place where justice was supposed to be untouchable, was wired for destruction. Elliot's breath hitched, images flashing rapid fire through his mind. The crowded courtroom, Judge Morales banging her gavel. The reporters, the bystanders, all gathered around the witness stand. The stand where Leon Carson had been questioned, where Elliot had stood to call out the fraud. The stand Elliot was meant to approach again under new allegations. Bailiff, hold him for questioning, bad as he had said, and Elliot had planned to return, to testify, to be lured right back into that space. Bruno whined, sensing his master's sudden spike of fear. Elliot dropped Vance like dead weight, securing his zip-tied wrists to a rusted pipe, trusting Bruno to watch him for the precious seconds he needed. He fumbled with the radio, forcing the cracked speaker closer to his ear. The next burst of communication was sharper, more urgent. Primary at 20 meters. All units green light. Detonate on confirmation. Detonate. Elliot's stomach churned, bile rising. He surged to his feet, yanking Bruno along, sprinting through the labyrinth of alleys, muscles screaming, lungs burning, because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the innocent lives packed into that courthouse, blind to the doom ticking under their feet. He burst onto Main Street, traffic frozen, civilians scattering at the sight of a battered man and a snarling German shepherd, sprinting like hellhounds, were clawing at their heels. Ahead, the courthouse loomed, a stone monolith under the searing sky, and Elliot could almost feel the charge humming in the air, a monstrous heartbeat synchronized to a remote detonator waiting for a single word. Bruno barked, sharp and desperate, his nose cutting through the sense of hot oil, fear, and something else. Something acrid and metallic that Elliot's human senses barely registered. Explosives, the courthouse steps blurred as he vaulted them two at a time, slamming through the main doors. The cool air inside tasting of old varnish and pending death. The courtroom doors were still ajar, left open in the aftermath of the chaos inside. Her assistants packing evidence boxes. Oblivious, Elliot skidded to a halt just inside the threshold, scanning, analyzing, and then he saw it. The witness stand, the heavy wooden podium that had been a fixture of countless trials, looked normal, sturdy, but beneath it, hidden in the hollow base, the faint glint of exposed wiring caught the edge of a fluorescent light. Elliot's mouth went dry. There, nestled in the shadowed gut of the stand, was a small black device with a blinking red light. Steady, patient, merciless, Bruno froze beside him, ears flattened, every muscle rigid with alarm. Elliot's heart pounded so loud he thought it would detonate the bomb itself. He needed to act now. No time for bomb squads, no time for procedures. He sprinted toward the stand, arms waving frantically, shouting, "Clear the room, clear the building now." His voice a whip crack of command, the masses using telephone or spare. Confusion locking their bodies to the floor. "Move!" Elliot roared again, Bruno barking furiously, teeth bared. The room broke apart in a shriek of terrified motion. People stumbling over benches, papers flying, bodies slamming into doors in blind panic. Elliot vaulted onto the witness stand, hands grappling for the wires, the device, anything he could reach. But there was no timer display, no visible trigger. Just that slow, sinister blink, red like arterial blood. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind screaming through scenarios, and in that hesitation, the radio in his pocket crackled to life. A cold voice cutting through the din. "Confirm primary presence, detonation on my mark." Bruno barked again, whirling in a tight circle, torn between defending Elliot and driving the panicked herd out the exits. Elliot's fingers brushed the slick casing of the bomb, cold and smooth and inevitable. He heard the door to the street bang open behind him, the first waves of evacuees pouring out into the sunlight. But he also heard another sound, closer, sharper, the metallic click of a weapon being cocked. Not outside, not from the assassins, but from within the courthouse. From someone who had stayed behind deliberately. The metallic click reverberated through the courtroom like a starting gun, and Elliot's body reacted before his mind caught up, shoving his weight sideways off the witness stand, just as the bullet screamed through the air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. Bruno barked ferociously, launching himself toward the shadowed figure near the jury box, the assassin firing again, the second shot carving a splintered line across the heavy wood of the stand. Elliot hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his teeth, but he rolled instinctively, coming up behind a thick bench as cover, his pulse thundering in his ears. The bomb still ticking under the stand, patient, deadly. Bruno collided with the gunman, a blur of muscle and fury, jaws snapping around the man's gun arm with surgical precision. The weapon clattered away, spinning across the tiled floor. Bruno's snarls drowned out the man's grunt, grabbing the dropped pistol with one hand and covering the room with the other. Adrenaline sharpening his vision to a razor's edge. Two more figures burst through the side entrance. Tactical vests, weapons drawn, eyes cold, professional killers sweeping the room with lethal intent. Elliot ducked low, firing 2 rounds toward their feet, forcing them to split apart and seek cover. Civilians still screamed in the corridors beyond. Their panic feeding the chaos. Bruno held the first gunman pinned, growling deep in his throat, the man struggling uselessly under the weight of the German shepherd trained for war. Elliot's mind raced, calculating every second spent here was a second closer to detonation, and the bomb's ominous blink seemed faster now, an angry heartbeat counting down to oblivion. He shouted, his voice cracking through the madness. "Clear the building! Bomb under the stand!" Someone heard him, the last few assistants grabbing each other, stumbling out the back doors. Judge Morales nowhere to be seen. The assassins repositioned, one ducking behind the judge's bench, the other vaulting low over the defense table. flanking Elliot's position, pinning him with suppressing fire, bullets chewing into the benches, sending shards of wood flying. Elliot dove again, dragging Bruno with him by sheer instinct, the dog snapping once more at the pinned gunman before retreating with Elliot. The wounded man groaned but didn't rise. Blood pooling under his arm, Elliot fired twice. Controlled bursts, forcing the advancing assassin back, but it was a delaying tactic at best. They needed an exit. Fast. Bruno whined. A sharp, urgent sound, his nose twitching wildly, his body rigid. Elliot realized it at the same instant his hand brushed the floor. The vibrations, the faint tremor rolling up through the marble tile. The bomb wasn't static anymore. Someone had triggered a remote arming sequence. Bruno smelled it, felt it. The volatile cocktail of chemicals vibrating at a pitch only animals could detect. Elliot gritted his teeth, forcing down the panic clawing at his throat. They had seconds, maybe less. He scanned the courtroom, spotting the shattered window near the bailiff's station. A risky jump, but the only way out that didn't funnel them directly into more gunfire. He whistled sharply. 3 clipped notes. Bruno responding instantly, snapping into a tight formation beside him. Elliot sprinted, dragging Vance's body with him for the first few yards before abandoning the dead weight. Survival demanded sacrifices. Glass exploded outward as Elliot hurled himself through the window frame, Bruno leaping after him in a perfect arc, gunfire following them in a stuttering roar. Elliot hit the ground outside in a bone-jarring tumble, Bruno rolling and springing after the first, bleeding from shallow cuts but otherwise unharmed. Inside, the bomb detonated, a deafening roar that shook the courthouse's very foundations. From a bloom of fire and smoke gushing from every shattered window, Elliot covered his head instinctively as shards rained down, the concussive blast flattening everyone within 100 feet. Alarms screamed into life, distant sirens wailing. Elliot forced himself up onto his elbows, gasping, blinking through the dust and heat. Civilians staggered through the parking lot, coughing, bleeding, wide-eyed with terror. And through the chaos, a different kind of storm gathered. Police cruisers swarmed the scene, tires screeching, officers pouring out in tactical gear. Weapons raised, barking commands. Hands in the air, get on the ground. Elliot raised his empty hands slowly, heart hammering, Brulam low beside him, still ready to defend to the death. A pair of officers rushed forward, tackling Elliot to the ground, pressing his face into the searing pavement. Someone shouting about terrorist attack, the words slicing deeper than the handcuffs, biting into his wrists. Elliot struggled, shouting hoarsely, "There's a bomb inside. I saved them." But his words were drowned under the thudding boots, the crackling radios, the roaring fire consuming what remained of the courtroom. Bruno barked furiously, straining against the leash now pinned under Elliot's body. But rough hands grabbed the dog, hauling him back, muzzling him despite his thrashing protests. Elliot twisted his head enough to see Vance being pulled out from the alley behind the courthouse, still zip-tied but smirking through bloodied lips, speaking urgently to a cluster of senior officers. Spinning his own narrative with the oily ease of a career liar, the realization hit Elliot like a blow to the gut. They were framing him, twisting the truth even now, painting him as the cause of the destruction he had fought to prevent. Elliot's jaw clenched until it ached, helpless rage searing his veins. The officers lifted him roughly to his feet, dragging him toward a waiting cruiser. Flashes popping from a dozen cameras as reporters circled like vultures scenting blood. "Former officer implicated in courthouse bombing," someone shouted. The words ripping into Elliot's ears, branding him anew. Bruno lunged against his handlers, his eyes locked on Elliot, loyalty burning bright even through the muzzle and confusion. Elliot met his gaze, pouring every ounce of silent communication he could muster into that connection. "Hold on. Stay strong. This isn't over. Not yet." The cruiser door slammed shut, the city outside blurring into streaks of red and blue as the vehicle sped away toward headquarters, toward another courtroom where lies would wear the mask of justice. And somewhere in the distance, above the sirens and smoke, a new plan was already forming in Elliot's mind. The cruiser lurched to a stop outside the police headquarters, the sharp screech of brakes through the thick, grimy air. Elliot tensed as the doors flung open, rough hands yanking him into the searing afternoon sun. Bruno barked desperately from the second cruiser behind them, the sound sharp, frantic, the only voice in the crowd that still believed in him. Officers formed a tight phalanx around Elliot, weapons slung low but eyes sharp, treating him like a bomb waiting to go off. He stumbled as they shoved him forward, through the glass doors, into the sterile fluorescence of the precinct lobby. Cameras flashing again, reporters shouting questions that blurred into meaningless static. His wrists ached from the zip ties, his mind burning with the knowledge that every second spent here let Vance twist the narrative deeper. Elliot's gaze flicked to the far side of the lobby, where brass badges glittered under harsh light. A group of senior officers clustered around a heavy-set man in a navy blue uniform, his presence radiating authority and disdain. Deputy Chief Warren Hayes. Elliot recognized him instantly, the second-in-command to Vance. The man who had smiled into cameras and preached transparency while secretly pulling strings in the shadows. Hayes's eyes locked onto Elliot's with cold calculation, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features, as if Elliot were an inconvenient stain marring a carefully polished floor. Bruno barked again, pulling against his leash so violently that the young officer holding him stumbled, barely maintaining control. Elliot's heart twisted painfully at the sight. Bruno had fought and bled for this country, for justice, and now he was being muzzled like a mad dog. Elliot's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Hayes muttered something into his radio, a low command that made Elliot's stomach knot tighter. The officers dragging him veered suddenly, steering him not toward Holding but toward the side exit leading to the underground parking garage. Elliot dug in his, "Where are you taking me? I want my lawyer." But the hallway swallowed his voice. Hayes followed at a distance, his mouth set in a grim line. Bruno barked frantically, struggling harder, the young officer cursing as he fought to control the dog. The heavy fire door slammed shut behind them, feeling Elliot and his escorts away from witnesses, from cameras, from any shred of oversight. The underground garage was dim, the air thick with oil and rubber, the echoes of their boots ricocheting off concrete pillars. Elliot's senses screamed, warning him of the trap, but it was too late. They stopped near a black SUV idling in the shadows. Two plainclothes men flanking it, no badges visible, no words exchanged, just grim nods. Elliot felt the noose tightening, the scene locking into place like a vice. Bruno barked again, the sound ricocheting wildly off the walls. Then he broke free, the leash slipping from the young officer's sweaty grasp, a streak of black and tan muscle hurtling across the garage toward Elliot. The world snapped into slow motion. The closest plainclothes man drew a weapon, raising it toward Elliot's chest. Hayes barked something unintelligible, but the muzzle flashed before Elliot could even dive, and Bruno, brave, beautiful Bruno, threw himself into the path of the bullet without hesitation. The crack of the gunshot was deafening. Bruno's body jerked mid-air, momentum carrying him into Elliot's legs, knocking him to the ground. Elliot hit the concrete hard, the air driven from his lungs. Bruno collapsed beside him with a guttural whimper, blood already staining his fur, spreading fast, animal sound tearing from his throat as he scrambled to Bruno's side, ignoring the guns still trained on him, hands shaking as he tried to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, buddy, stay with me," he whispered hoarsely, tears blurring his vision. Bruno's eyes met his, wide and dark and full of confused loyalty. Elliot barely registered the chaos erupting around them. Hayes shouting orders, officers yelling over each other, but one sound cut through it all, the unmistakable click of another weapon being cocked directly above him. Elliot froze, lifting his gaze slowly, and there he saw it, the true betrayal. Deputy Chief Warren Hayes standing over him, gun drawn, no badge visible, no orders shouted, just a cold, efficient expression of a man tying up loose ends. Elliot's blood ran ice cold, understanding flooding through him in an instant. Hayes hadn't come to arrest him, he had come to silence him permanently. Bruno's sacrifice had bought Elliot seconds, precious seconds, and Elliot intended to use every one of them. The shot rang out, sparking against the concrete where Elliot's head had been. Officers scattered, some ducking for cover, others frozen in horrified realization that this was no longer an arrest but an execution. Hayes cursed, advancing methodically, weapon raised, unbothered by witnesses, now because the narrative had already been written. Elliot, the disgraced ex-cop turned bomber, resisting arrest, forced into a tragic end. Clean, simple, no questions asked. Rage ignited Elliot's veins, white-hot and blinding. He grabbed the loose pistol from Bruno's side, the one the young officer had fumbled earlier, and fired blindly toward Hayes's feet, forcing him to backpedal, breaking the perfect script written for Elliot's death. Bruno whimpered weakly, trying to lift his head, and Elliot's heart raising his gun again. But shouts echoed down the ramp, more officers pouring into the garage, real ones this time, responding to the gunfire, confused, shouting conflicting orders. The chaos splintering any chance Hayes had at a clean kill. Sirens wailed closer, backup arriving faster than he could contain, and for the first time Elliot saw hesitation crack the deputy chief's mask. A tiny fraction, but enough. Hayes turned, barking into his radio, disappearing into the shadows between pillars. Retreating to fight another day, Elliot pressed both hands against Bruno's wound, sobbing broken pleas he wasn't even conscious of forming, his world narrowing to the shallow, ragged breaths of the only soul who had never doubted him, who had thrown himself into death's jaws without a moment's thought. Red and blue lights bathed the garage in hellish colors, officers swarming, guns drawn but pointed downward now. Confusion and suspicion thick in the charged air. Paramedics spilled from an ambulance, rushing toward Elliot and Bruno, barking urgent questions he couldn't answer. He clung to Bruno's fur as they tried to pull him back, his hands smeared with blood, his heart breaking with every weakening pulse under his palms. The paramedics worked furiously over Bruno's still body, voices sharp, hands sure, but Elliot barely registered their shouted commands, his blood-smeared hands trembling as he was dragged back, cuffed again but with less violence this time, the eyes of the surrounding officers flickering with something new, something dangerous to men like Hayes. Hayes' knees hit the concrete, but he refused to fall completely, refused to let the weight of grief crush him until this was over. Hayes was slipped into the shadows, but the lies he built were crumbling faster than he could run. Elliot's mind clawed through the haze of shock and pain, piecing together fragments of memory. Bruno ripping Leon Carson's wallet, the ID that had fallen, but not just that, there had been something else, a flash drive tucked inside the folds, nearly overlooked in the chaos. Elliot remembered the metallic glint of it now, the way Bruno had fixated on the wallet, not with aggression but with purpose. He had found something too important to leave behind. Elliot's chest tightened as he realized Bruno hadn't just been protecting him, he had been delivering the final nail in their enemy's coffin. Elliot fought against the officers restraining him, shouting hoarsely, "Check the wallet, Carson's wallet." There's a dry confusion rippled through the room, an officer muttering into his radio, another dashing back toward the evidence lockup where the few items collected from the scene had been dumped in the rush. Minutes dragged like years. Elliot straining against the cuffs, Bruno's shallow breathing the only thing anchoring him to sanity, until finally the officer returned, holding a small battered USB drive between gloved fingers. The supervising sergeant snatched it, barking orders to clear an interrogation room. "Get IT in here, now." Within minutes, a laptop was booted, the flash drive inserted, the room filled with a tense, electric silence. Lines of encrypted files blinked onto the screen. Elliot's heart hammered as the tech worked, bypassing layers of security with growing urgency. And then, like floodgates breaking, the truth poured out. Images, videos, bank records, internal memos, all bearing the fingerprints of a sprawling conspiracy that reached from the courthouse to the mayor's office, implicating not just Vance and Hayes but a web of officials, businessmen, even federal agents who had turned justice into a commodity to be bought. And the tech's face drained of color as he scrolled through the evidence, his hands shaking. This is enough to burn half the city down," he whispered. Someone bolted from the room, shouting for higher-ups, for emergency protocols. Within the hour, the precinct became a hive of frenzied activity. Secure lines opened, frantic calls placed, in less than 3 hours after Elliot had been thrown into a cruiser as a supposed terrorist, the FBI rolled into the parking lot in black SUVs and tactical vans. Their presence slicing through the confusion like a blade. Federal agents stormed the building, seizing control, walking down evidence, pulling officers aside for questioning. Elliot watched it all from a battered chair in the infirmary, his wrists still red and raw, but his back straight, his eyes burning with a fierce, unrelenting fire. Bruno lay on a stretcher beside him, a paramedic administering fluids, monitoring vitals, doing everything to keep the brave shepherd tethered to life. An agent approached, crisp suit, hard eyes, badge flashing. "Elliot Brooks," he said, Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "You've been through hell." Elliot didn't reply, just stared, daring the man to say the wrong thing. But instead, the agent nodded, grim and respectful. "We owe you." And in that moment, Elliot felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not healing, but the first crack in the monolithic wall of corruption that had crushed him for years. Agents moved quickly, arresting officers complicit in the cover-up, seizing Hayes' office, dismantling the criminal network that had thrived under the city's nose. Each arrest, each confiscated file, another vindication, another step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. News vans clustered outside, reporters jostling the narrative shifting at last, headlines scrolling across screens. Massive corruption scandal unfollowed. Wrongfully convicted officer exonerated. Hero K9 critical after saving courthouse. Elliot leaned back against the cold wall, his body battered, his soul scarred, but a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Bruno stirred weakly, a soft whine escaping him. Elliot leaned closer, whispering so only the dog could hear. "You did it, partner. You brought the house down." Bruno's tail thumped faintly against the stretcher, a ghost of the fierce warrior he had always been. Presky squeezed his paw gently, promising silently that no matter what happened next, Bruno would not be forgotten. Their story would not be erased. Outside, the sirens faded into a quieter hum, replaced by the relentless questions of journalists demanding accountability. And inside, somewhere deep in the precinct's heart, the last shreds of the old regime were being dragged into the light, kicking, screaming, but powerless to stop the tidal wave unleashed by one man's refusal to stay silent. One dog's refusal to back down. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, to hold the moment in his battered chest, to honor the price they had paid to get here. He knew this wasn't the end. The war for justice never truly ended. But today, for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had won a battle that mattered. And the final reckoning was still waiting, just beyond the horizon. The weight of years seemed to lift inch by inch as Elliot sat inside the federal courthouse 2 days later, his battered body wrapped in a suit borrowed from one of the sympathetic agents. A thin tie knotted clumsily at his throat, his hands calloused and scabbed resting on his knees. Bruno lay on a cushioned stretcher beside him, an IV line snaking gently into his leg, the paramedics and veterinarians working tirelessly to keep him comfortable. But even through the cocktail of painkillers, the fire in Bruno's eyes hadn't dimmed. Not completely. Not yet. The grand jury proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected, spurred by the avalanche of evidence Bruno had unearthed. The city had no choice but to respond. No time to spin the narrative, not when every news outlet from coast to coast was broadcasting the downfall of men once considered untouchable. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric energy, reporters packed into the gallery, cameras flashing, whispers darting like wasps through the heavy air. Elliot sat motionless, watching as one by one the architects of his destruction were led into the room in shackles. Vance first, face gaunt and defiant but eyes hollow with fear. Hayes behind him, lips pressed into a furious, bloodless line. Their lawyers whispered furiously, but the evidence was overwhelming, incontrollable, damning. The judge entered, her robes swirling around her in an almost mythic presence. Silence fell like a guillotine. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands stayed steady. Bruno stirred weakly beside him, his nose twitching at the shift in the room's energy. The charges were read, each word a nail sealing the coffins of men who had once held his fate in their careless hands. Racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, murder for hire. The list rolled on, a litany of sins finally dragged into the light. When asked to stand and enter their pleas, Vance hesitated, his jaw twitching, his fists clenching, but at last he bowed his head, voice thick and broken. "Guilty, Your Honor." Hayes followed, his voice little more than a growl of rage. "Guilt." The sound echoed through the chamber, a crack of finality that made the air easier to breathe. Elliot sat back, a shudder running through him, not of weakness but of release. The poisoned thorn finally ripped from his heart. Bruno shifted again, his head resting against Elliot's boot, his tail giving a single weak thump against the stretcher. Elliot leaned down, running a hand gently over the battered shepherd's head. murmuring soft words no one else could hear, promises and gratitude and apologies folded into one. The judge called Elliot forward, and he rose, every joint aching, every scar singing, but he moved like a man made whole. He stood before the bench, not as a defendant, not as an exile, but as a witness, as a survivor, as a man who refused to be broken. The judge's eyes softened as she looked at him, her voice firm but kind. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of this court and this country, we extend our deepest apologies," she said. "You were failed. Today we begin to set that right." Applause rippled through the gallery, raw and unrestrained. Elliot bowed his head slightly, emotion thick in his throat. Unable to find words that could carry the weight of the moment, he turned back toward Bruno, determined to share this victory with the only partner who had never betrayed him. As he knelt, Bruno lifted his head with trembling effort, his muzzle gray and blood-stained but his eyes bright. He struggled, inch by inch, to push his nose into Elliot's palm. Elliot cupped the dog's head with both hands, feeling the faint tremor of his heartbeat. Bruno's tongue flicked out once, slow and deliberate, licking the back of Elliot's hand in a gesture so filled with love, loyalty, and farewell that it shattered the last of Elliot's composure. Tears streamed unchecked down his face as Bruno's breathing slowed, his body sagging heavier into the stretcher. Elliot bent lower, pressing his forehead to Bruno's, whispering broken words of love and thanks. Around them, the courtroom faded, the noise blurring into a distant hum, until it was just the two of them, man and dog, brothers bound by more than blood or duty. And as Bruno's last breath slipped quietly from his lungs, his eyes slid shut in peaceful surrender, Elliot felt a terrible, beautiful settle over him. Bruno was gone. But he had not left Elliot with emptiness. He had left him with freedom, with honor reclaimed, with a future still unwritten. Elliot sat there long after the judge adjourned the session, long after the cameras stopped flashing, holding Bruno's lifeless body in his arms, rocking him gently as if he could still be comforted. Outside, the city stirred, change rippling through its bones, the monuments of corruption crumbling one by one, and somewhere deep inside Elliot Brooks, a seed of hope took root, fragile, precious, undeniable. He would carry Bruno's memory forward, carry it into every step he took from this day onward. And though the war for justice would never truly end, today, in this courtroom soaked in blood and redemption, they had won something no darkness could ever take away. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next journeys we will take together. I would love to know, which moment moved you the most? Where in the world are you watching from? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every word.